Topic Notes 4.2, Biodiversity. Now, when people consider high biodiversity areas on the planet, most of the time the example is going to be a tropical rainforest, and that's exactly what I have pictured here. This is a rainforest in Costa Rica that I got a chance to travel to, and inside those big, dense stands of trees is a huge amount of biodiversity, different insect species, birds, mammals, all sorts of things. Now, the ocean has high diversity as well. One of the highest diversity habitats in the ocean would be a coral reef. Now, what do all of these high diversity spots on the planet have in common? Well, a lot of times it has to do with how stable the environment is that allows for the evolution of diversity within a system. So let's get going and learn all about it. Now, our big main idea here is that biodiversity is the measure of the variety of living organisms and is related to ecosystem stability. So, of course, we have a number of targeted learning goals that we're going to talk about that have everything to do with biodiversity, including what are the different types of biodiversity, specialized versus generalized niches, and understanding the importance of biodiversity and its services that it provides. Biodiversity is a broad concept that generally refers to the variety and the variability of life. So we can define it like this. Biodiversity is a measure of the species, genetic, and ecosystem diversity of different species. Now, here are our two poster children for high biodiversity, and that would be the tropical rainforest and the coral reef. Now, of course, there's a lot of other habitats that are on varying different scales of biodiversity, so we'll look at all that as well. Now, I just got done mentioning three different types of diversity. We have species diversity, genetic diversity, and ecological diversity. So let's focus on species diversity here, which is the abundance and richness of a species in a given area. And it can be broken down into two different parts. We have species abundance, which would be the number of individuals per species, and then species richness, which is the number of species in an area. And the fun part is collecting this data out in the estuary. And you can see some of the pictures down below. This is when we've gone out with students and we take a seine net. Now, a seine net is pretty cool. It's got floats on the top and weights on the bottom. And you sort of pull it through the water and then you pull it up and you can count whatever you catch. Now, let's say we caught three different species. We caught penfish, we caught pufferfish, and maybe we caught some blue crabs. All right, there's three species in there. That would be the species richness, the number of species in an area. But let's say we counted each individual species in there in our net, and we found out we had about like 25 penfish, we had maybe 3 checkered puffers and 4 blue crabs. So those individual numbers of those organisms, that would be the species abundance for each of them. So that's the difference between species richness and abundance. Now, ecosystems with many different ecological niches tend to support larger numbers of species, which is why coral reefs tend to be one of the most species-rich areas on Earth. Now, on the flip side, we have things like sandy shores, and that's pictured on the right, and they have a much lower species number, generally speaking, because it's a little bit of a harsher conditions. You know, you have wave action, you have the particulates of the sand moving around all the time, you have sun, you have wind, you have a lot of things going on to kind of disturb the peace, if you will. We also have genetic diversity, which is the variety of forms of genes or alleles within a species. Now, genes are made up of nucleic acids, DNA or RNA, and are the developmental code of life on Earth. Alleles are one of 2 or more alternative forms of a gene. Each species has a set number of genes. Now, when we look at the population versus an individual, it's a little different. A population has a different gene allele frequency than an individual organism of that species. Now, this is why genetic diversity is important, because within a population, you need to have somewhat of a spread of gene allele frequency. And this allows a population to change over time. Because if conditions, for example, change a little bit, there may be some members of the population that have essentially traits that will help them adapt to those changes. and eventually those traits will get passed on and the population will shift in characteristic in that direction. Individual organisms can't really do that. It has to happen through reproduction and passing along those alleles, which is why any reduction in the number of alleles may result in a population being less able to adapt to changes in the environment. So let's dive into an example. Let's travel to Long Island, New York. And here you can see on the right a diagram, a little bit of a map. And you see Long Island Sound with study site labeled 1. And then you'll see those study sites increase numerically 2, 3, 4, all the way to 8 until the kind of opening of the sound into the open ocean. And then study site 9, 10, and 11 are out in the Atlantic Ocean proper. Now, why we need to know this? Because as you move closer to 1 inside Long Island Sound, it's going to be more exposed to fresh water. The farther you get out to the opening of the sound around 7 or 8 study site, that's going to be more saltwater inundation. And of course, 9, 10, 11 are going to be completely in the open ocean. Now, we're going to study an animal called a mussel, which is a type of clam. It's sort of a bivalve, and they attach themselves to rocks and substrates and things like that. And they have to deal with salt water, obviously. Now, if they are living in study site 1, you're probably going to be a little less involved with salt water than if you're living in study site 11, 10, and 9. Now, each of them have a particular gene that deals with or helps to regulate the salt balance within their body. Now, you can imagine that the mussels that are more exposed to full salt water are going to need that enzyme a little bit more than those who are more, in a freshwater area. And now, if we look at the allele frequency of mussels between all of these study sites, that's exactly what we see. Study site 1, 2, and 3, the allele frequency for this enzyme, which is LAP94, is actually much lower. That's the kind of purple wedge in the little pie charts for each of the different sample sites. Now, as we move out of the bay, that percentage of mussels that have that allele frequency for that particular enzyme gets larger and larger. And of course, the highest allele frequencies happen in study site 11, 10, and 9, which are in the open ocean. So that tracks. So essentially, this population of mussels within the Long Island region have different allele frequencies within individuals within the larger population. Now we get to ecological diversity. Now, this is the variation of ecosystems or habitats on a regional or global level. And this includes both biotic and abiotic components of the environment, right? So we're talking about the living things and the non-living things all within these different ecosystems. Now, Earth's ecosystems do not exist isolated, right? They merge into each other, and thus it is somewhat difficult to sort of isolate them and measure them. And that's why we need to look at, of course, everything in totality. But obviously there is a difference between what's going on in a coral reef, for example, on the left. And then inshore of the coral reef, you might have seagrass beds, which is the middle picture. And then, of course, along the actual shoreline, you might have mangrove shorelines. So these are 3 different ecosystems within, or habitats within this region that have differences. However, there are species that travel in and out between them as well. Now we're going to turn our focus to the concept of stability and how it relates to biodiversity. Now, ecosystems with higher species diversity are considered more stable and resistant to ecological change. We'll get into what that means in a minute. Environments that are either unstable or extreme tend to have lower diversity. So the factors that influence diversity are as follows. First of all, keystone species, specific species that are sort of linchpins to the environment. Those are really important for the stability of an ecosystem and overall biodiversity. The niche structure is also an indicator. If you have a very complex niche structure, you probably have high diversity. If you have a very simple niche structure, probably low diversity. Now, stability in the environment is still important. How stable is it for organisms to live there? And this often depends on several different factors. How much nutrients are in the area? The temperature, the light intensity, dissolved oxygen, current, etc. All of these things sort of combine to create either a stable or a very unstable situation. So favorable and stable environments tend to have higher biodiversity. Now, these types of habitats experience infrequent disturbances, which means generally speaking, they don't have a lot of things that disrupt whatever's happening in that ecosystem or habitat. They have very stable or moderate conditions that fluctuate very little, which means all the parameters, whether it be temperature, dissolved oxygen, sunlight, whatever, is very much at a steady state throughout time. Not a whole lot of change back and forth. This allows species to really kind of get in there and specialize and depend on whatever factors are involved in that habitat. Now, on the flip side, we have extreme and unstable environments, which tend to have very low diversity. These habitats experience frequent disturbances, so there's lots of change happening all the time. Examples are sandy shores, muddy shores, hydrothermal vents, and deep reef slopes. Now, they can have extreme conditions like hydrothermal vents, where you have extremes in temperature or salinity or exposure to air. There's a lot of different options here depending on what you're talking about. So let's look at some examples. So on the stable side of life, stable and what we call non-extreme would be coral reefs. And this is interesting because they occupy less than 1% of the ocean floor, but contain 25% of marine life. That's a huge percentage compared to how much actual space they occupy. They need optimum conditions for the producers. So we're looking at tropical climates, warm water, plenty of sunlight, and they thus have very, very long food chains and very diverse food webs. Another example would be rocky shores, which are, again, stable and non-extreme, and they actually provide very good attachment surfaces for organisms, whether it be algae, mussels, barnacles, clams, things like that. And this provides protective habitat for them. And thus, they have less chance of drying out or being dislodged, things like that. So rocky shores and coral reefs, both stable and non-extreme habitats that tend to have high biodiversity. Now, hydrothermal vents are a bit of a wild card here because they are stable, but they're extreme. So the extreme part is pretty obvious, right? They have there's toxins literally coming out of the seafloor, right? There's incredibly high temperatures plus incredibly cold temperatures. The pH is much lower. You have high pressure. You have no sunlight at all because of how deep they are. Now, only a few species have adapted to the conditions. So there is a low biodiversity compared to, let's say, a coral reef, for example. However, it is a relatively stable environment, meaning that there is a constant flow of these hydrogen sulfides, so you have chemosynthesis going on, so a constant flow of food until, of course, the vent shuts down. But while it's running, it's relatively stable, yet extreme. Now let's look at our non-extreme unstable environments. So a reef slope is the steep vertical walls at the front or fore reef. This is the side of the reef that faces the open ocean. And they are not considered extreme because you don't have the kind of extreme conditions you find at a hydrothermal vent, but the conditions are constantly changing. As like waves pick up, you get that swell hitting the fore reef. It's going to take the brunt of that. It's going to wear down the rock. It's going to create sedimentation. It's going to absorb all that energy. The sand substrate is easily eroded away. It's very difficult for producers to attach due to the wave action and whatnot. It has relatively low diversity compared to the reef itself. Very few can adapt to it. You have burrowing animals, worms, clams, crabs, things like that. So relatively shorter food chains and lower biodiversity in that reef slope, and that's what's pictured at the top here on the slide. Now, sandy shores are also, again, non-extreme, but very unstable. They're exposed to wave action, water, air. Conditions are generally just constantly changing, and very few, again, species can adapt. Very burrowing animals can, and things like that. So again, it has relative relatively low biodiversity compared to some of these other habitats. Now let's focus on ecological niches and biodiversity. Ecological niches may be broad or narrow depending on the circumstance. So increased biodiversity tends to lead to increased competition and what we call niche specialization, which means the niches become more narrow. A specialized niche tends to have narrow range of food requirements and live in very specific habitats. For example, a butterfly fish. Butterfly fish have small protactile mouths that tend to feed on small invertebrates, including essentially coral polyps. Gorgonians are a type of soft coral, zoanthids are a type of soft coral, and tunicates are very small as well. So they're very targeted to those specific items, and thus they don't have a wide variety of food options, which means if something changes, if their food source goes away, they oftentimes don't survive because there's not another option for them to just go to. On the opposite ends of the spectrum, we have generalized niches, which tend to exploit a wider range of food sources and live in a wider range of habitats. A good example of this would be tuna. They're very migratory. They feed on many different species, and thus anything changes in the environment, they're able to sort of shift from one food source to another without missing too much of a beat. So habitats with high biodiversity tend to have more specialized niches. Essentially, the more stable the environment over time, the species tend to adapt, reducing competition. An example of this would be resource partitioning, which we mentioned before. This means that narrower, more specialized niches tend to work because it reduces the overlap within species and thus reduces competition. So why do we care about all this biodiversity stuff anyway? Why is it so important? Well, there's a lot of things. First, they protect the physical environment. These ecosystems with high biodiversity tend to protect coastal environments specifically. Here is a coastal mangrove system, and that helps to essentially prevent erosion along the coastline, these root systems. Also, coral reefs help prevent the larger waves from entering the coastal region, which would cause erosion. So all of these things help protect the shoreline. Now, another big one is climate control. The producers help regulate atmospheric increases in carbon dioxide concentration, and of course, the ocean has a lot of producers. High productivity of phytoplankton and seagrasses is key. They store twice as much carbon dioxide per hectare as terrestrial rainforests. Again, huge, right? They help reduce man-made impacts such as ocean acidification and global warming. They're also very important in oxygen production. In fact, scientists estimate that somewhere between 50 to 80% of oxygen production for the atmosphere comes from the ocean. Hungry, anybody? Yeah, the oceans provide a lot of food sources. They provide them for humans, algae, crustaceans, fish. Look at the graphic on the right. Just a ton of different food sources come from the ocean. In fact, if you track from 2016 to 2020, both fish and seafood as a percentage of global meat, we go from about 26, 27% to 28%. So roughly, that's a decent chunk of the protein of the planet. Now, of course, that's not the end of the story there. If you actually look per country, there's certain countries that rely a lot more heavily on marine meat or protein. China, for example, is one of the largest. Here's one that you might not have thought of before. Sources of medicine. New medicines actually are derived from marine plants, animals, and fungi and bacteria. Essentially, we are looking for natural chemical compounds. Here's an example of a few that are undergoing clinical trials. A pain relief drug harvested from marine cone snails, you can see pictured up on the top right, a schizophrenia medication from a marine worm, wound healing drugs from corals, and anti-cancer drugs from a range of marine bacteria, bryozoans, fungi, tunicates, and nudibranchs. It's really crazy how much the natural world has to offer in chemicals that are good for medical development and pharmaceuticals. Now here's an example, a keyhole limpet which is found along the rocky shores of western North America. A protein extracted from that is called hemicyanin, and that has immunotherapy properties, essentially treatment of inflammatory infectious diseases. Now, of course, there are serious threats to biodiversity that are out there. The current rate of species lost are far greater than in the past due to human influences. So what are some of the things that we're doing to decrease biodiversity? First of all, habitat destruction. Just look at that picture on the far right. That's all coastal shoreline that has development on it, big high rises and whatnot. This affects habitat, right? The introduction of invasive species like the lionfish and other species that essentially unbalance an ecosystem. Pollution is a huge problem, and of course, over-harvesting and hunting of marine species. Now, this loss of diversity and essentially the food web that can collapse as a result of this is a direct impact to human food sources in the ocean as well. So that can affect human cultures and livelihoods around the world. All right, that's a wrap for us today. And remember to make sure you're looking at each targeted learning goal as you study. And of course, until next time, keep learning.